Michelle, a seasoned Zoom person, obviously. So firstly, I'd love if you could just post any questions that you want addressed over the next 59 minutes. So anything that you want particularly covered, or if you're just open to whatever comes, let me know if there's something, just so I know if there's something that particularly I should emphasize or ensure I do cover. Anyone got any requests? And yeah, please do keep introducing yourself as well. Well, I'm going to keep going. Okay, I'm going to assume that everyone's happy just with whatever I've got and there are no specific requests. How to scale this approach to use different types of conversations and workshops. Thanks, Michelle. Hey, Karina. Oh, from California, nice. Look, I'll keep going because it looks like if there are more requests, I'll try to keep an eye out for them. Looking for a broad overview from Shimon. Okay, if there are any other requests, I'll try to keep an eye out for them, but and do keep saying hello and keeping the chat up as well. So firstly, a warning, there is no such thing as a free lunch, and I have to feed my family, and this is a free webinar, so I figure I can expose you to a minute. I'll try to limit it to 2 minutes pitch. So if you need to avert your gaze, I totally understand at this point. But I did want to plug two things in particular. Later on, actually right now, there's a live, it's gone live now, this 7-week virtual crash course. You can actually sign up for it. It begins in February and March. It's based on my work in Learn to Learn and really turning that into a 7-week guided process. There are different tickets available. You can buy the ones which actually have support, although I think the one that has the most support, which is basically 6 months of me providing that support, there's only 2 tickets left of that one. But otherwise, there's quite a lot of tickets for the other options, including if you're really skint, if you've got very little cash at the moment, or if you're unemployed, there's a $50 option. I don't want to restrict it to people based on access to cash. So have a look. There's a link to the sign up sheet from my website. In addition, the process I'm going through here is something that I've run workshops around over the last few years, and I've been continually improving. I ran it at DevLearn a couple of years ago, been running it in different shapes and forms in Australia. It's available to be run in-house to companies. So if you want your team to be uplifted in this sort of approach, I really do customize it with specific kind of scenarios for your context, and go into it a lot more deeply so you can get a sense of it. And my last plug is I do lots of stuff and I sell lots of stuff. So check out my website for more information and contact me if you like. Plug over, it's safe to look again. So I wanted to kick this off with a bit of background because I started this process off by looking at this performance consulting engagement piece using design thinking. And I happened to work for a large vendor at the time, and we were getting quite complex jobs. And I had a process where I was using a more purist view of design thinking. And this will probably be familiar with you for a lot of people now. Design thinking has become quite commonplace in L&D these days. This was like I was one of the early adopters of it. And I think I went through a process of trying to use a more purist approach before realizing that the reality was for a lot of people, they didn't actually have the opportunity to use that purist approach. So I'm curious if you were to rate, I expect that a lot of you may have done the 1-day design thinking workshop or campaign, like a bit of a boot camp thing. But I'm curious if you could rate your experience of design thinking at the moment. 0, never use it. 1, use it occasionally. 1, use it occasionally. 2, use it often. 3, use it all the time. So a few 1s, 2s there. Quite a few 1s. Great, thank you. I mean, that gives me a sense of it, like quite a few 1s, quite a few 2s too, which is fantastic that you're using it often. I think the interesting thing for me was I did I was using this process about 6 or 7 years ago, and one of the big four banks actually approached the company I work for and said, can I do training for them? And I went in and did training for them, and I showed them how to use design thinking in a very purist approach for what I thought was L&D. And I went back a few months later. It was a big, like there was over 100 people in their L&D team at the time. And I went back a few months later and talked to people and said, well, what impact did it have? And I was kind of saddened and surprised that very few people were actually using the techniques I went through. And that was largely, I found when I looked at it a bit more, it was because there was only a handful of people there who were already playing in the space of being a performance partner, of being asked to do quite complex engagement with the business. Most people were in a more order taker kind of role where they were just being given content to work on. And so this is what I found. Most of them, and certainly in my experience, a lot of people in L&D, we tend to go through this process. That outside of the L&D world, there's a business need or pain. Someone in the business says, okay, we need some training around this, we need some uplift, and they basically make a request for training, and then they come into the L&D world, and the L&D are then charged to design, build, and deliver that training. And the request tends to be, people need to know, people need to understand, or even we've got this PowerPoint that you need to turn into an e-learning module, or something to that effect, or like people, it's a very tactical kind of request. And what I found was that rather than trying to focus on that big piece around design thinking, there was this key moment right here between that request for training and the design and build and what we do. And so instead, what I focused here on is, how can I reframe that moment when a request comes in? How can we reframe that to actually go in a different direction? So how can we do a performance gap analysis at that point, rather than just taking the order, to take it into a different, to reframe the problem and take it into a different direction? And I should say, this is more than just about what I'm going to go through in this session today. It is actually a broader conversation about how we as professionals are understanding the politics of our organization and actually using our persuasion skills. And there's a quick diagram here I've captured of some of the things that we as professionals in an organization, it actually works in an organization or even as a vendor, that we as learning professionals or performance professionals need to actually pay heed to. What I've found is that when I've done these sorts of workshops and asked people where their strengths are, weaknesses are, a lot of the weaknesses seem to be around amplifying champions in particular. I'm not sure if that's your experience, but I mean, maybe you could write in the comments what your weakest spot is. Do you feel like, what's your weak point there? I imagine it's going to be amplifying champions. But I'm not necessarily going to go into that in a lot of detail today. I'm focused more on some of these other elements, but I did want to raise this. Yep, that constantly needing to network, and yep, amplifying champions is often the challenge. So in terms of reframing that order taker request, I wanted to show you a process I've been using. It's developed by me over many years of experimenting, and thanks to all those clients who are the guinea pigs as I continually refined and continue to refine this process. But in particular, I want to acknowledge these sources of wisdom. Kathy Moore with Map It, Design Thinking, and I could have put many sources there, but I like the Field Guide from out of IDEO, and Nigel Harrison's performance consulting work as well. Depending on what your emphasis is, if you're already someone who's a partner of the business and is kind of got a seat at the table, I think you can almost go straight to some of that design thinking work. If you're not, maybe that some of Nigel Harrison's work is fantastic. And particularly if you're in e-learning, I think Kathy Moore's work really comes into mind. And Kathy Moore's has got so many fantastic resources on her website, but the book is just a wonderful resource as well. Oh, I didn't see the follow-up book to Nigel Harrison's work, so I'll have to look that up. Thanks, Con. So in terms of reframing, in terms of the process I'm going through, there's two elements. I'm going to focus on the first one more. It is reframing the order request Um, and then there's the evidence-based solutions. So there's almost two sides of the story. It's like, firstly, we're diagnosing the problem, and secondly, we're actually working out what strategies, what solutions can address that problem. And in the first realm, we're trying to change the conversation from about content to performance. That's a key thing. When most people engage with learning and development, it's a content conversation. And that's a massive change. The other one is, how do we uncover underlying issues? How do we take stakeholders on the journey? And that's a really important one. What I found is, when I was doing this, one of the reasons I went to design thinking was, even when we got, I thought, the right solution, and we diagnosed the problem and we saw behind what the client was telling us. So a client would tell us something, and myself and my team would actually identify some underlying needs there, and we'd develop a solution for it. Unless we took that stakeholder on the journey with us, the solution wouldn't work. So how can we actually take people with us on the process? Also, how can we get them to realize that sometimes it's more complicated than they think, and that we actually need to develop further investigation? So rather than us just saying that and them just dismissing us, how can we get them to, it's almost like, how can we show rather than tell? And then the evidence-based solutions, which I'll go through a bit later as well. So the process I go through is summarized on these two, on this slide. On this side, it's, well, firstly, the gap analysis. The first one, which I won't talk about as part of my process, but I wanted to just highlight now, is there's an invitation that's required. When someone comes to you, and which is, I guess, very typical, what I've found is that people will come and say, we need e-learning for this uplift, or we need, like, you know, a workshop so we can actually do X, Y, Z. Or here's the PowerPoint, can you turn this into an e-learning module? Or can you turn this into a face-to-face workshop and deliver it to these people? So when you get that request, there has to be an invitation to actually reframe the conversation. And the way I might do that is something like, you know, this is fantastic, and I always take the content that they're giving me. I always take it from them. Like, if they're giving me a PowerPoint, if they're giving me some sort of slide deck or something, I'll take it. I don't reject it. I don't want to make them wrong. So I'll take it, and I'll say, actually, a really important thing here is, I do not make eye contact with the content. As soon as you make eye contact with the content, you're kind of going down this vortex of content conversations. And I think that background is kind of suitable now, because you do not want to get caught in a content conversation at this point. Later on, maybe, and probably, but right now you don't want to talk about content. You want to understand the problem. So you take the slide pack or whatever they're giving you, and they say, that's fantastic, I'm sure I can help. And what I've really found the most use and the most efficient use of your time is if we have half an hour just to catch up, so I can really understand some of the underlying issues that you're facing, and we can really target what you need. That may or may not go down very well. Yeah, what if the content makes eye contact with you, you'll just have to blink and look away. But it really is challenging, I think, at this point to say, how can you actually have that half an hour? You're basically trying to get half an hour buy-in. You don't want to scare them off. You don't want to say, well, actually, I'm not looking at this content. We've got to go through this broader process. That's going to make them run, because they've got 20 billion things to do that day, and you're just one of the easy things on their checklist. So you've got to look at it from their perspective. They want simple, they want ease, and they think this is a pretty simple job. They think all you've got to do is reframe this or repackage this content they've given you. And so one of the big parts of the invitation is almost selling it based on, this will be more efficient for you. This will, you might say things like, what we've found is, by having this half an hour up front, we can really deliver on your needs with the most effective way, and it will save you time overall. Something like that, you know, whatever. You need to know the stakeholder, you need to understand how to speak to them, but what you're trying to do is get them in a room for half an hour, in a virtual room or a physical room. After that, we're going to go through, it's basically a simple gap analysis, and many people will have a process like this, but you're looking at future state first. So what do you want as success? What's currently there? And then what's the gap? Simple. That's all you're doing. Future state, current state, what's the gap? And I use that. I'm doing a couple of big engagements at the moment, And I'm still using that same process, even on a bigger scale, to Michelle's point. So even when I'm doing like, you know, a 20-day engagement with a company, looking at a much more complex situation, I still look at what does success look like? What's our current reality? What's the gap? I have more opportunities to do more detail. But right now we're doing this in a half an hour conversation. And with the performance solutions, it's about restating the defined problem, so we're all on the same page with what the problem actually is, ideate options, and rather than just jumping straight to training, I'd really encourage people to start with other options, and I'll go through this a bit later. Rate and organize those solutions, and also then choosing, is it a campaign or an ecosystem kind of design, and I'll raise that, I'll just show you some options around that later, and then test, iterate, and deliver. So that's the sort of process. So this is where I brought in the design canvas. This one on the left is really designed to analyze the gap, and the other one is looking at the solution. I don't know what the ABCD approach is either, but I'd be interested to know. And look, this isn't unique. There's lots of people doing gap analysis. That's why I wanted to raise Nigel Harrison's work, even Kathy Moore's work. Everyone's doing a form of gap analysis. And the companies I work with, I often make the point, what I find is even experienced people, they often just use the force. They kind of like get there, but they couldn't explain how they do it. When I go through this process, hopefully you can say, well, I do that, I don't do that, I might not do it that way, but it's trying to bring a bit more presence and metacognition, I guess, to your awareness to your process. So you might not go with this process in a pure way, but ideally you'll have a process that you can explain and you can replicate. That's one of my aims. Yeah, the force is tacit knowledge. And yeah, it still has limitations, particularly when you're trying to scale with other people and trying to identify some gaps and have a bit more deliberate practice to it. So here's my big tip. You can download the performance canvases from my website and you can just print them out and you can use them. But particularly for that first page where you're actually analyzing the problem, do not just sit there and write it on a piece of paper. You've got to get it up on a whiteboard or a flip chart, and you've got to be very visual. And that's a crucial change that I found, because one of the points of this process isn't just to be right. A lot of you have the experience. You can probably walk in, someone's asked you stuff, particularly if you're embedded in the organization, and straight away you're thinking, well, actually, I bet this is really about this other problem that's underlying, and I've spotted this a while ago. So you can be right, and it's pointless because you're not going to take the organization with you, right? So one of the purposes of this process isn't just to be right and get the right solution. It's to get the stakeholders on the journey with you. And part of that is actually a co-design process where you're actually getting their information up on the whiteboard or a flip chart and drawing it up simply on the whiteboard. So use my canvas as a model, but literally draw the simplistic version up on a whiteboard. So here's like, you know, I wouldn't draw all this detail up on a whiteboard. I would literally just draw a little target on the right about future state, and I draw a little picture of a person on the left. And then I just leave every other gap. I mean, people who've done workshops with me have seen how crappily I draw these things on purpose, because they're disposable tools. You know, it's not meant to be something really beautiful. So firstly, we'll start off with future state. And future state is really looking at what does success look like for this project. And there are a few ways of asking for this, to try to draw out what people actually want for this. So firstly, it's saying things like, it's trying to shift beyond the request that often happens. You know, most people will say things like, a stakeholder will normally say things like, people need to understand, people need to know. And whenever they're talking about people need to know, they're just focusing on a knowledge-based solution. And as we know, there's often a lot more to it than just like cramming knowledge in people's head and expecting behavioral change. So, you know, a typical one, the example I often use is, you know, there was a sales group and the key leader of that sales group came to us and said, my team needs to know how to close. That was the thing. They need to know how to close. I've got this content on about closing. I want it on like an e-learning thing and maybe a face-to-face thing. And that was the conversation they wanted to have. Should this be e-learning, face-to-face? What combination of it should be? And all they wanted to do was teach people how to close. And what I've found is that I use this in my head. I don't show this to clients. But down the bottom here are the sort of tactical options that people can use to create change. Up here is the business objective, and in the middle, there's a performance objective. And we're trying to get that performance objective. But what I find is often people's requests will come down at the level of tactics. People need to know, people need to understand. And so one of the ways you're trying to get them to shift from that tactical kind of request is to say, what are the business objectives that are prompting this? And one of the ways you can do that in a very simple kind of way, because you've only got half an hour, it has to be quick, right? So I often will say, oh, fantastic. I really understand that people need to understand how to close, that this team needs to know how to close. And I'm curious to know, just say you after 3 months when we've finished this project and it's been rolled out, and you get in the lift with the CEO, and the CEO says, well, what have you achieved with this program? What would you want to tell them? And it might be that they know how to close, but it's more likely going to be that we've actually, in this case of this particular job, it was actually we were able to roll out this new product launch. And the new product launch went well compared to the last 2 product launches, which were crap. And so we're trying to actually get them away from the tactical and really up to that business point of view. What's in it for the business? And then in between, we're trying to find a performance objective. So the performance objective might be more about, well, as a team, we actually need to reach these particular KPIs, these sales rates. We need to actually promote the new product rather than just selling the ones that they're familiar with. So there's a performance objective in there. A performance objective is usually based around a team-based outcome, not just an individual. And it's somewhere between knowing something and what the business strategy is. It's the hardest bit to land on. Yeah, and then in terms of metrics, to your point, James, that's the next point. After I try to identify this performance objective, I ask, how can we measure that? How do we know if we've hit it? And what's the business metric? It's not just a learning metric. It's not just about knowledge retention or something like that. What indicators, ideally existing indicators in the business, can we identify that can then show that we've won? It is complicated at this point too, because a lot of these indicators have multiple causal factors. It's not just an A and a B kind of relationship. So it is hard. I'm just curious to see, for most of you, do you find that it's challenging at the moment to try to get that performance outcome? Do most of you tend to have just that order taker request and find it hard to shift out of it? Do keep putting the comments in, because that is a challenge. I do find this is the hardest bit. If you get a performance objective that you can hang your hat on, then the rest of the process goes well. And I think part of it is another one of my favorite phrases is when people say, people need to close, or people need to understand, or people need to feel more engaged in this process, or whatever they say. One of my key phrases to get them from the bottom part of the pyramid where they're living up to a performance objective, the first way is to say, what would the CEO actually care about? Another one is saying, and what would that give you? And so someone says, people need to know about, what's an example in your world? I don't know what an example is. Okay, so people need to know how to use this software. And what would that give you? And what would that give us? If people could learn how to use this software, what would that give us? Well, they'd be able to and that might lead to whole questions around efficiency, or like some delivery of some customer service rollout, or something bigger than just understanding this particular piece of software. Okay, so next we're moving to, the key thing here is at that point you've identified a performance outcome and you've got shared reality. So you're saying, so what I'm hearing about is, yes, we need to get them to close. And really what's important in this job is that we actually are getting the sales team to support this new rollout of this new product. Or it might be, yes, I understand that this software rollout is really important, but what we're really looking at is, I don't know what's behind the software rollout, I think it was Kim who asked that example. It might be, for example, if I keep saying, what does that give you? What does that give you? Or what does the executive really care about? It might mean a better NPS score because they want better customer service and they want to like be known as the customer service organization. And this software thing might be a knowledge management system, which is meant to help them serve those customers more effectively. Again, based slightly on reality. But whatever it is, you're trying to understand what is the actual performance outcome. It's not just about learning this thing. It's about learning this thing to achieve that. And so that's the important thing. What's the that? Because someone's already made an assumption that they've got to learn this thing to achieve that. So you want to just take a step back and understand what the performance outcome is. Once you've pinned down a performance outcome, for example, rolling out a new product and having fantastic sales impact with that new product, not just the BAU sales. Next is you're asking who's actually involved. And this is a really great time to ask, one of my most common mental models that I use all the time is the Pareto principle, is the 80-20 rule. So I basically say, firstly, who's involved in this? Who's touching this? And for a new product launch, it might be the manufacturing team, it might be sales, it might be some BAs, it might be some analysts, it might be some key line managers. There might be a whole bunch of, it might be customer service as well, account managers. You basically just get them to list all the different groups that are involved in this process. Next, I ask who to target. So my question is that Pareto principle rule, who is the 20% of these audience groups that are going to get us 80% to reaching this performance goal? And I keep having on the whiteboard, I'll keep pointing back to that section of the whiteboard, say that this is the performance goal we want. It's not just about getting the sales team to close, it's about rolling out this new product. And it might be that the client the stakeholder at that point will say, well, actually the key point here is the BA team, because they've got to make like an analysis of this, or the manufacturing team, or it might be some other team who they didn't come into you to actually talk about in the first place. That they will have an aha moment. If you told them this isn't actually about the sales team, this is about some other team, when they came in, they would just ignore you probably. But if you actually take them through this process of identifying the performance goal, then saying who are the groups involved, then asking who, if we magically change their behavior without any stress or anything, if we could just magically change one group's behavior, who is going to have the biggest impact on our performance outcome? And that's letting them decide on who's going to make that impact. So, yeah, so Con, it's true. This is not a common conversation. This is the whole point of this process, really. It's trying to change that conversation from, I'd like this slide deck presented as an e-learning module. The whole point of taking them through this process is trying to have that metrics conversation. So hopefully it will support it. Thanks, Con. So once we've said who to target, ideally, in my experience, about 10% of the time, a client will suddenly have a aha moment to say, my God, this job isn't actually about the group I thought about. It's actually about a different group altogether. And that's wonderful, because you've already become a performance partner. You've helped them realize that the job is different to what they initially conceived of. And you've already won a friend for life there, or a business partner for life. So that who to target is that next step. Once you've actually got who to target, and this is again in a half-an-hour engagement, I draw up a quick persona. And the way I introduce a persona is and I know a lot of you are probably using personas these days. I think it's much more common than when I started using it a while ago. I think a lot of people would be using personas in some shape or form. But the way I pose personas is to say, I mean, particularly you have to make a distinction if they've got anything to do with sales and marketing, because sales and marketing tend to use more data-driven segmentation rather than what I would use as empathy-based personas. Empathy-based personas are kind of like a snapshot. So I'll say something like, look, this isn't meant to represent everybody. This isn't meant to really try to bottle them up in one particular person. What it is, it's just an example. It's just a snapshot of that audience group. So we can actually, myself and my team, you don't make it about them because they don't need anything. They're complete people who've got it all together, the stakeholder. So you say, so myself and my team can just really have a sense of empathy for this audience group. And we can actually design from that place of really understanding their needs and their context, because that's how we know we're going to really impact and make behavioral change happen. So something like that, where we're trying to make that shift. I keep personas pretty simple at this level. I've got a more detailed version of a persona, which I do when I've got days to do the project rather than half an hour. But this is my half an hour version. It basically says role, what's their context. So that might be they might work part-time, or it might be that they are on the road, or it might be, that they're in the central office or whatever. What goals do they have? Professional goals. Like, what's the key thing that drives them? And often it's related to KPIs. It might be something else. In some cultures, organizational cultures, it's one of the goals is to basically keep their head down and not really raise attention to themselves. Like, it just depends. And again, you're not trying to talk about everyone. You're just trying to give a snapshot. Pain points. That's one of the most useful things I've found. Like, what's the thing that really, because pain points, like we're driven by loss aversion, we're driven by pain a lot of the time. It would be great to have this forward-thinking approach, but that identifying some pain points is really massive in terms of being able to design for these people effectively. Because if you can address some of those pain points, that's really huge in terms of being able to engage with them more broadly. Needs and insights. I find insights can really only come through a process of empathy interviews or observation. It's very unlikely that a stakeholder who isn't part of the audience group is going to be able to really have a great idea of what these people are really thinking or what's really going on for them. And partly you're using this process to expose that. So if this person is struggling, sometimes I even say, I'm just curious, obviously you're working on this other level. How often do you get to talk to this particular audience group? And if they haven't talked to them for a few months, or if they're not in regular contact, I just let it sit there, because hopefully by the end of this process, they might realize that we've got to go back and actually talk to the audience group and get the audience group in the room. Again, if I said to them, we need to get the audience group in the room, they'll immediately think, too expensive, not going to bother. But if you go through this sort of process, you can often get them to realize that they need to bring that group in. And also what I do is, so this is kind of current state. This is at the top bit is current state. Down the bottom, I talk about the change. And this is a bit of a tweak on traditional empathy maps. I basically say, in relation to whatever the change is, to the new product launch or to the new software rollout or whatever, how do they feel, think, and do? So what's their emotional response? What's the voice in their head telling them? And what actions they take as a result? So in relation to the product launch, when we did this persona, and we actually did do some empathy interviews around it, the feeling was kind of frustration or nervousness. The thought was, I can't believe that they're going to push another crap product on us, because manufacturing just aren't up for the task. Like, they didn't believe that the product was going to be like a reasonable product. Or something. Another thought would have been something like, there's no way I'm going to burn my reputation on a product that isn't going to live up to what they've told us it's going to do. Something like that. There was this disjuncture with trust. And then the do was, they were going to sell the old product line. They weren't going to sell the new product line. So you can start to see that how that piece, the bottom piece, is particularly useful. Again, it's just one persona. And if we have time, if it's a bigger engagement, or if a bigger engagement spins out of this conversation, I would often go to 3 personas. I also don't use names or ages or genders anymore. I use names. Actually, I go with Alex, Sam. I go with non-binary kind of names. But I found that if you have a name or a gender or an age, unless the job is about that, people just bring all their unconscious bias to the table. I do it too, but it's just there. So as soon as you say it's a mum, people say, even saying not just a woman, but a mum. Like, if you say it's a woman, people might say, okay, it's a mum. They've got a child. Suddenly they become a single mum who has to work part-time and has got all these, it's almost like watching Netflix. It's that sort of stereotype. So unless it's relevant to the job, I have removed those elements. And I found it hasn't impacted on the ability for people to empathize with the character. I find a bigger impact, this is just anecdotal, but just having a picture of a person has really allowed them to actually empathize, but getting rid of that sort of unconscious bias kind of prompts has helped. It'd be great if I had more time. I'd love to hear, but do post your experiences with personas, whether you're using names, whether you're finding that unconscious bias is a thing, whether you're using a different sorts of templates. Again, this is a quick and dirty template. I've got a more detailed one, which I use for bigger engagements. So next is required behaviors. So over on the right, you've got what the performance goal is. On the left, you've got your current state of your people, of this particular group, this snapshot of a person, because we're not doing the whole shebang. We're focusing on this particular group, 80-20 rule all the time. Next, you're saying, what behaviors does this person have to take to hit their performance goals? And the way you define a behavior is, because people will say, they'll still say, well, they need to understand how to close, or they need to feel, or they need to understand how important this software package is, or whatever it is. What you're doing here is you're saying a required behavior is something that you can actually see. So if there's a video camera there, it would actually record it. It's not just something that happens in someone's head. It's a behavior that actually physically happens. And that helps them reframe some of the things that they're going to come up with to actually turn them into behaviors. Finally, if they've got a list of behaviors, so it might be that they need to actually, have a needs-based conversation with their clients. They might need to check in with manufacturing or with the other development team to work out where the product is actually at. They might need to check in with the account manager. They might need to share some product information which is relevant for the new product line. You've got a list of often 6 or 7 things. Next is I actually do a bit of education with the client. So far it's just been me asking questions. Here I do a 2-minute spiel about how people change. And I'll draw up a stick figure of a person separate to this. I'll draw up on a flip chart or something. And I say, just for this next part, it would be really useful just to get some terminology in order. And so I just want to go through 4 ways that we can actually classify the way change doesn't happen. Usually I talk in negatives, unless it's a place which has positive psychology all over it. And then I talk in terms of levers for change and try to speak more positively. But I find people understand the negative language. So I talk in terms of blocks. So there are 4 things that can block behavior change. And I go through how there's knowledge, mindset, skills, or environment. And so I'll go through each of them very quickly. I'll say, for example, you might be able to give someone a knowledge about something, which is kind of what they've been talking about the whole time. But if they've got the knowledge, if you just give them the information, then they can make a change. So for example, if there's something that they need to do, like if it's closing, for example, you give them the knowledge about how to close, you just give it to them in some whatever format, and then they can do it. That's a knowledge thing. Or it might be a skill block. That is, that they've got the knowledge, but they don't have the actual skill, which is something that needs to be practiced to be able to do it. Or they've got the knowledge and they've got the skill, but they don't have the mindset or motivation. So they understand the information. They've got the ability. Technically, they've got the skill. They've practiced it or whatever, but they don't care about it. They just not driven to do it, or they've got a mental block about it, or whatever it is. In this case, I won't go in this case, just a mental block. And the last one is they know how to do it. They are able to do it. So they've got the skill. They want to do it. So they've got the mindset or motivation, but the environment doesn't allow them to do it. And it might be whether it be the KPIs or the time or the access to various tools or whatever, they're just blocked from doing it. So you're trying to go through each behavior and say, is this primarily about knowledge, skills, motivation, or environment? What's going to stop them from doing, or what has stopped them from doing this behavior? And sometimes a client will say, well, it's actually about knowledge, skills, and it's about all 4. And you're just trying to say, again, what's the main ones, 1 or 2 things. So you're trying to, again, analyze the problem by saying, what are the key elements here? Once you've got that, you've basically analyzed your problem. Because what you've done, sorry, just going to the next slide. What you've done is, what the project is really about. You basically understand what the performance challenge is beyond just the initial request they're making. You know who's really involved and who of those people are going to have the most impact if they change their behavior. You know that group's current context and attitudes, and you know what change they will have to make and what sort of things are stopping them. That's the analysis of the problem. Often, if you just get to the end of this by half an hour, that is fantastic. I don't try to do a solution right there on the spot. Sometimes I throw in, it might lead to this or might lead to that, and you can see how it goes later. But I'm just saying right now, all you're trying to do is get to the point of, this is the problem. So what I'm really hearing is, I really get that closing part of it, but what I'm really hearing is that this project really is about supporting the new product launch, and that of the different groups that are involved, the actual B2B sales group is actually the most crucial. And that their current context and attitudes, part of that is them having a big mindset block about not trusting the existing teams, not trusting the delivery team to actually deliver on what the products they're meant to be selling. And so that's kind of you're trying to summarize this problem and restating it in a performance kind of process rather than just a knowledge kind of frame. That's crucial because, again, you're trying to take your stakeholder on towards the part of this journey as well. Now, in your own, whether you do it by yourself, whether you do it with a team, or whether you do it with a stakeholder, this is the second part, which is relatively new, of the performance canvas. Some of you may have done the workshops I've run in the past. This part is totally new in terms of my development of it. So up the top here, this is about solutioning. So up the top, it's about restating the problem. So just restating to be able to say, who is the audience and what is the required behavior change? What's the performance objective and how's it measured? And what's the impact or value for the business? I find this is a useful one as well, because again, it just makes sure that to be a performance partner in an organization, we've got to be providing value, not just to the stakeholder who's in front of us, but to the broader organization. So we need to know what's the bigger game, because we're building our influence, we're building our impact, and in the process of amplifying those stories. So just making sure that we've got alignment with where the business is trying to go, where the organization is trying to go. And finally, there's this problem statement, which is actually adjusted from a design thinking option, which basically says, how might we help persona? So how might we help Alex to what's the required behavior change? So the required behavior change might be share the product information based on needs-based conversations with clients. Given that we know, and surprising insight. Again, it's pretty hard to get a surprising insight from half an hour. It's usually surprising insights come from empathy interviews and observations of the audience group. But the surprising insight might simply be, in this case, that there's a break of trust with the sales team and the delivery team, or that there's been that might be enough. So whatever you're framing up the problem, and that's a really useful thing to frame up again. So it's not just how can we close, you've actually reframed it for the stakeholder to say, this is my understanding of one of the key aspects that we're really trying to deal with here. And sometimes I have up to 3 problem statements to try to capture particularly different sorts of insights that have come up. Thanks, James. Plug. And so next is, to Con's point earlier, where he says, yeah, environment is the one that's been really overlooked. I agree, Con. Often, up until a year ago even, I was saying to people, if clients identify that the main issue is environment, capture it, but try to get them to say, is it beyond environment? Is it skills? Is it knowledge? Is it motivation or mindset? Because environment is kind of out of our scope. And often we can't actually impact on the environment, which is frustrating. But one of the things I've really thrown myself into over the last year or so is behavioral economics. And I'm not going to go into it here. I've done a presentation, if you want to look at it, on SlideShare. I did a presentation last AITD conference, and I think to a few AITD chapters, I think Adelaide and Melbourne, which looked at the impacts of basically the concept that when we are, one of the key core concepts of behavioral economics, and I'm going to oversimplify it, is basically that people, in Daniel Kahneman's words, think fast or think slow. And most of us will think fast for most of the day and most of our life. And that is, we make split decisions very fast, very quickly. And we don't actually use our rational brain and consider problems in a more rational way. We're just making this quick decisions based on tacit knowledge and our mental models and basically our biases. And that works for us a lot of the time, because the world's a really complex place. We're making decisions all the time, hundreds of them all the time, about how things are working in our environment. And so we've got to use that. It's a survival thing. And knowing that, we can design differently. So what environmental nudges is about is this idea that we can actually, rather than making people snap out of their fast thinking and go to slow thinking, which is, there's limited resources for that to happen in a day, we can actually use the fact that people are in fast thinking by trying to nudge their environment to support them to make the right choices. And this is, I maybe haven't described it in a way that sounds less paternalistic, but like, it's a big debate about, is this, from the left and the right of politics, is this acceptable to do, is it manipulative, and so on. And there's been general consensus that people do appreciate nudges, particularly when it's not for sales or something like that. It's actually trying to help them do more or achieve more in their life or in their work. So this one is, how can we make it easy, or the alternative hard? So how can we nudge ease or add sludge? They talk about adding sludge to make the alternative hard. How can we make it attractive? How can we make it social? How can we make it timely? A big part of this is identifying what opportunities there are. And I don't have time to do it today, but one of the tools, one of my go-to tools is a journey mapping tool. I use a journey mapping tool both for current state and future state. And when you do a journey map for current state, that is, it's basically kind of a swimline process where you're looking at an event-based kind of experience. And honestly, each of the journey maps I do, I use a different format. Like I use what's required. Like an onboarding one, it would have, the timeline of before the interview, before, like, and it would go from the first day, the first week, and so on. So it just depends on what you need. But with a journey map, you can often identify what are the key pain points, what are the key points of friction. And then you can start to say, well, how can we make it easy, make it attractive, make it timely, or make it social? And by social, that is often, if you've got some sort of peer, either, like, with the examples with tax, like if you say to someone, oh, 90% of people in your area have actually submitted their tax on time, that you're more likely to actually submit your tax. Because one of the heuristics that we use is, like, rather than thinking through a decision for ourselves, we're thinking, are people like me doing this? And if they are, it's safe to follow the herd. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just one of the heuristics. It's one of the fast thinking things to happen. So if you can identify a group and say that this group is actually doing this, then you can actually encourage people to take that decision. Easy and even a timely. One of my favorite examples with timely was with an insurance company. They got people to classify how many hours they were driving as part of a claims form. And when they actually put the signature at the above where they were classifying how many hours they were claiming, as opposed to, most forms, you fill out the information, then you sign, say, yes, this is true. But when they got them to sign at the top saying, everything I state here will be true, there was actually a change in the stats they got because more people told the truth. So just by priming people and making it timely at that point of decision, to remind people about, like, telling the truth. I mean, there's other examples of that, of, like, from telling fables, or telling, passages out of the Bible even have impacted even on non-religious people to try to be a bit more honest. So anyway, there's lots of really interesting stuff in that nudge area. But I guess my point here is we tend to go straight to changing people. And that is actually one of the hardest things we can do. As you know, changing people, like, who kept a New Year's resolution ever? Or who's actually still eating chocolate, or, doing all those things that you want to stop. So behavior change is bloody hard. That's one of my big catch cries. Behavior change is bloody hard. We're in the business of behavior change. Don't give up. And we should focus on other things to do before we hit to the behavior change. So one of the big things is this nudge area. I've talked a bit about that because it's probably something which a lot of people aren't really incorporating much yet. But go to my slide share. There's a presentation I did on it, and the slides are pretty self-explanatory. The next is habits. I like to use this framework from Charles Duhigg, although James Clear has really done well in terms of summarizing a lot of Charles Duhigg's work and BJ Fogg's work, and even, what's her name? Katie Milkman, was I going to say, who's done a lot of work around habit formation. And I like all their work there for different reasons. But James Clear is probably, if you've only got time to read one book, it's probably the best one to read, Atomic Habits. And this goes into habit stacking opportunities. So what habits do people already have that you can add a habit to? So one of the things we did at a leadership program I've talked about in the past is, we did this thing of encouraging leaders to reflect while they were having their coffee. So that coffee was already a habit for a lot of people. So we got them to actually reflect on, thanks for pointing out that video, to reflect on what they were doing and how they could improve on work while they were having coffee. So you're tying one habit, a preferable habit, to an existing habit. Otherwise, you're identifying cues, routines, or rewards. You've probably seen that cycle. If you haven't, just Google it. It's really simple and it makes sense. And you can have a habit statement saying, when this happens, the audience group will, what's the routine, and because it provides what reward. And BJ Fogg makes the point that one of the challenges with habit formation is that people tend to focus on a distant reward, when really a small, quick reward works better than some sort of distant big reward. That is too abstract for people. Then after we try to nudge, after we try to develop habits, finally, as a last resort in our toolkit, we focus on traditional development approaches. And here you can see a grid I've created based on, is it about mindset? Is it about knowledge? Or is it about skill? And I've broken it up into resources, experience, people, and training. Training, again, down the very far end. I'm all for training where it's appropriate. I just hate when we go there first. So you can see training is at the very far end of this process, because I think there's so many other things we can do before that. So for example, what resources can we provide? So if it's a mindset motivation thing, it might be some campaign elements, like it might be some reminders. If it's knowledge, it's providing knowledge-based concept diagrams, metaphors, the whole knowledge thing. Most people know now that, knowledge is embedded through space recall and space retrieval. That's kind of a pretty mainstream kind of understanding now. But still, rather than going there as the first stop, is there a way that we can outsource the knowledge into some sort of tool that people can access more efficiently as a resource, rather than trying to stick more stuff in their head, even though it's done efficiently through space retrieval? Can we actually do it so they can access the information without having to memorize that? Because there's probably lots of other better stuff they could memorize. And then checklists and guides can help skills. So rather than just taking away from some of the skills, you can have a process. It is. And that's a great point, Jacinta. Like, a lot of these overlap. It's not like a pure thing. It's not, it'll just be a nudge. If you're talking about resources, often it's going to be a nudge as well. And I did grapple with this a lot, but at the time I decided to keep nudges separate, because for me, and I think a lot of L&D professionals, it's not something that we've normally just done as part of our design process. I think in a couple of years, this will look different. I'll probably integrate it a bit more. You can see experiences, people, and training. And the point is, you're trying to actually, if you're trying to embed knowledge with training, you do go to space retrieval, but hopefully before that, you've asked yourself, can this actually be captured in a knowledge base and accessed there? Can it be better knowledge sharing with people where there's actually discussion forums or something, before you say, yeah, we've got to stick it in their heads and we're going to do it with space retrieval as a last resort. Oh, thanks, Shimon. Yeah, in terms of just trying to break, I think a lot of people do this tacitly. I'm just trying to bring more, I guess, focus to it, and more self-awareness to our process. And that allows us, because I do think we tend to go to train. Even I do it. Like, I go to training really fast. Like, I can just see the course in my head, and I've got to put the course aside and force myself to go through this process. And often that has killed the course by the time I get there, which is really fun to be able to kill a course in your head. Sounds evil, but so then I'm going to go through this last bit, which is, once you've identified some of the solution elements, and often this is a bit of a shopping list. You've got these, because I do tend to work in blends. It's not just one little e-learning solution. It's like a broader picture. And basically you're saying, what are the preferred solution elements? So what are the things that really, and often I will do a grid. I will often do impact versus effort grid. And if it's a workshop with the stakeholders, ideally with this audience group, I even get them to pin up the possible solutions up on this grid. Then I go to, so at this point, if you've got a shopping list, I think it's really important not to stay with a shopping list. There are two frames I use to pull this together, because you want an end-to-end solution. You don't just want a list of little things. I would love to kill the LMS, partly. So firstly, you can think of a blended campaign, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but the blended campaign is this idea of an experience, and it's more like a traditional course, but a blended one, where you're preparing people, you're priming them. It might be with 360s or some video primers to get them sparked and framed up in the right way. It's giving them knowledge or some ability to practice something in a safe space. And then you're scaffolding this kind of on-the-job experience, and you're helping them connect with other people and resources on the job. So it's almost a supported on-the-job experience. And then you've got this other bookend of a more formal kind of approach where you're consolidating, you're getting feedback, you're holding them to account, because if you just do this first bit and then just put them on the job, often they won't change their behavior, especially if it's something challenging. But if they know they've got this thing to report back to, a second kind of bookend of this formal approach, I find that people are usually a bit more open to seeing this as a program rather than just they've just been put back in the wild and they can forget about it. And then what are your embedding strategies? So in a way, this blended campaign is trying to focus on the workflow, but it's trying to scaffold it in a very, very supported course kind of styled approach. The other approach is a more purist approach of just saying, let's jump straight into the ecosystem. We don't need a course or campaign. It's more about just designing the right ecosystem for people. And this is my ecosystem diagram, which I've shared around a bit, so you may have seen before, and there's information on that. I'm not going to talk about that today. So I kind of decided in my head, is this a blended campaign or is this an ecosystem design? If it's a blended campaign, eventually it's going to move to a BAU state where it is an ecosystem design, but it's almost got a more transition point to it. Hopefully that makes sense. So at this point, I often ask too, what are the riskiest assumptions? So rather than a pilot, I hate pilots, where a pilot is basically saying, we're going to do this on a small scale, and if it doesn't work, you're screwed, basically. Whereas a riskiest assumption test is more about what's the things that we know in the back of our heads, subconsciously, we know that it's going to, if this screws up, it's going to be because of this, or it's going to be because of that. And how can we test it? And how can we do a field testing plan and do some low fidelity prototypes or split testing to actually get a sense of whether this works or not? That I'm going to leave that there. That's a whole conversation in and of itself. But hopefully that's enough. What I've aimed to do in this hour is to give you enough to be able to use the performance canvas either as a pure approach or to like really supplement what you're doing or bring more awareness to what you're doing. Because I imagine a lot of you are actually doing a lot already with this sort of stuff. So now it's your choice. You can either, if this has helped you and we meet sometime, drinks are on you. I demand a smoothie if it's daytime, or a wine if it's past 6, and that will be fine, and we're good. We're good after that. The other option is you can get in contact and we can work together. Check out my Learning Agility course. If you've got an L&D team or you're part of an L&D team, I run this as a workshop, which is much more in-depth. It's much more experiential. It uses customized scenarios and so on. Or you can get in contact with me about my other stuff via my website. Either way, big thanks. Stay connected. Link up with me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and send. And you can also sign up to updates via my website. But if anyone's got any last questions, I'm happy to answer them now. I can stick around until about 5 past. But thank you for everyone who's got to go. I will send out this recording as well. So thank you so much for your time.